My dad told me a terrifying story about Grandma, and my repressed childhood memories are slowly returning. Part 1. I've not seen my grandmother since 2009. Following a catastrophic argument with Dad, she moved away. I only found out when I cycled past her house and saw it for sale. My father was elusive about what transpired between them, but I knew that it was something awful. A mother and a son don't drift apart on wayward tides. It took willful rowing to put distance between them. Naturally, I wanted to see Grandma. I wanted to know what had been said or done to alter our family. I assumed that she had told Dad her new address, so I would beg him to let me visit her. However, he refused my requests. Several years ago, I did a little detective work and opened a letter addressed to Dad. I recognized Grandma's handwriting from birthday cards I'd received over the years. My father scolded me for rummaging through his post, of course. After that, his mail was delivered to a separate P.O. box, preventing me from intercepting any more letters. Dear John, please forgive me, Mom. That was all the letter said. Unfortunately, there was no return address. Anyway, when Mom died in 2018, I stopped asking about Grandma. Grieving became our sole focus. For a long time, I only thought about my mother. She'd been struggling psychologically for years, and she was missing for a few months before someone found her body. I don't really want to talk about that. I was simply giving some context for the horror to come. To understate everything, it has been a painful few years. I'm 24, and I haven't asked Dad about Grandma since I was a teenager. Truthfully, I decided a while ago that life had to continue. Dad's life had to continue. Pressuring him to dredge up an old bust-up felt unloving. I didn't need to know what had happened with Grandma. The ship had sailed. My father is the only family I have left, so I didn't want to irreparably ruin our relationship by persistently badgering him about his mother. But last night, something unexpected happened. "Kara," Dad shouted from the living room. "Come here, sit with me for a minute." Gulping, I tentatively entered the room and chose an armchair opposite the sofa on which he slouched. I was panicking because I thought it might be time for a talk about me still living at home. I finished university a couple of years ago, and I've got a job in sales, but it doesn't pay nearly well enough for me to move out. "You okay, Dad?" I asked. He sighed. "Yeah, I'm fine, but I've been thinking lately." "Uh-oh," I teased, hoping a classic dad joke might relieve some tension. It didn't. "You've not asked me about Grandma for years," he said after a long pause. I was flabbergasted. Dad didn't mention his mom, not since their unexplained estrangement. I hardly knew how to respond. After several awkward seconds, I realized that I was simply sitting there, mouth agape, staring silently. My father adjusted his reading glasses, which were perched precariously atop his clammy nose, barreling down the slope. He looked anxious. Could this finally be it? I wondered. "I'm coming to terms with things, Kara. After all, you're old enough to go out and make your own decisions," he said. "And I often find myself wondering whether you still want to see your grandma." I shrugged. "I stopped asking about her because I could see how much it upset you." Dad smiled weakly. "I know, and I appreciate it. We've been through a lot. But what I'm saying is that I'm aware of your age. You're an adult now. I worry sometimes that you might go off and try to find her. I'm sure you'd struggle because your grandma doesn't want to be found. Well, she might try and contact you. Maybe she already has tried?" I shook my head. "She hasn't." Dad seemed to ease up a little. "Good. That's good. But I realize that if I really want to keep you safe, I have to tell you why you shouldn't contact your grandma." I nodded. "It would help to know why you two fell out." Suddenly, it was Dad's turn to gulp. He shifted his body weight in his seat, stalling for time. I found my eyes wandering to the night sky outside our living room window. Torrential rain pummeled the tarmac of our sleepy road, and a solitary lamppost was scarcely visible through the cascading curtain of droplets on the glass. "Your grandma and granddad always had a strained relationship," Dad eventually started. "That's why I have so many issues, I think. I just hope none of that resentment rubbed off on you. My mom and dad were always good to me, but they weren't good to each other, and they seemed oblivious to the effect that had on me as a child." I nodded gently. I could remember Grandma and Granddad bickering throughout my early childhood. And then one day, my grandfather left her. I always told Mom that she was a bit too harsh on Dad for his long business trips. He was just trying to provide for us. But when he left her, I obviously empathized and took her side. "So, I don't want you thinking of me as the bad guy," Dad said. I shook my head. "Never. I'm dancing around the subject." "You only have one question, I imagine," Dad said. "What changed?" "Dad, you don't have to tell I started." "I do," he interrupted. "If you stop me now, I might never summon the courage again." "Okay, I found something shortly after your granddad left, Kara. I was clearing out your grandma's attic, and there was a cardboard box labeled The Catalog. It was full of photos." My dad paused, voice croaking, before he continued. "Photos of missing people," I later learned, and every person's story was the same. These candid photographs were taken from a distance, in parks and busy shopping centers. Men and women. That wasn't what scared me. It was the photographs taken in the attic. Unimaginable brutality. I won't say any more than that. Quaking at a revelation I never expected to leave my father father's lips. I sat in silence, processing the horrifying information. My mental cogs were turning, but I hadn't yet realized what I was still repressing. When I confronted your grandma about it, she burst into tears, Dad hoarsely whispered. She said it was the reason Granddad left. He discovered her secret. Obviously, I told her that I was going straight to the police, and she just said she understood. She didn't try to stop me, but she fled that very night. And 14 years later, there's still no sign of her. I just hope wherever she went, she stopped hurting people, stopped taking lives, and that was it. My dad's terrible story. I couldn't find any suitable words, so I stopped searching for any. We both sat for a prolonged period of silence, watching the rain continue to beat down on the world outside, a world which suddenly looked a little darker to me. Eventually, I went to bed, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't sleep. My head was worrying, though not for the reasons one might expect. You see, Dad's story didn't fully add up. I remembered something. I used to stay at my grandparents' house from time to time, and they'd often let me bring a friend or two. Given that I was an only child, and they didn't want me to have a boring sleepover with two oldies, they knew who I'd invite. It was always the same two girls, Sophie and Francesca. In fact, Grandma and Granddad often insisted on me inviting my best friends, and my friends loved my grandparents. Well, mainly they loved the sweets that Grandma and Granddad would give us before bed. Plying us with succulent, sugary goodness should have stimulated our minds, kept us awake. Yet, we always slept like babies, but not every time. One night, when I was around 6 or 7 years old, I woke in the early hours of the morning. It was still dark outside, and I felt unbelievably groggy, as if someone had snapped an elastic band around my brain to restrict the blood flow. After a few seconds, I became aware of my surroundings. Francesca was fast asleep, but Sophie's sleeping bag was empty, and the door to my bedroom, Dad's old room, was wide open. I eyeballed the pitch-black upstairs landing through the doorway. My eyesight was hazy, though I'm sure I wouldn't have been able to see anything anyway. My ears, on the other hand, were working perfectly. That must have been what stirred me from my sleep. The sound of creaking floorboards above my head, a series of wooden groans from the attic. My immediate thought was that Sophie was messing around up there, and I worried that I was about to be in big trouble with my grandparents. So I gingerly rose to my feet, almost passing out as I did, and I tiptoed quietly out of my bedroom, trying to navigate the blackened landing. I didn't want to turn any lights on, as it might have alerted Grandma or Granddad, but the moaning sounds of the attic floorboards persisted, along with a muffled voice, and I knew it was only a matter of time before my grandparents woke up anyway. "Sophie," I hissed, hoping she would hear and my grandparents wouldn't. The creaking immediately stopped, and I held my breath as I finally accepted something. Those sounds are too loud to be Sophie's footsteps. I hurriedly crept back to bed as floorboards, like oak piano keys, creaked along the length of the ceiling. I managed to slide under my duvet cover and squeeze my eyelids together as the attic door opened with a giant roar. It was followed by someone heavily clambering down the ladder. I remember striving feverishly to feign that I was asleep as the unknown figure lumbered across the landing. I kept my eyes shut, trying not to cry as I listened to the strained breathing of the figure who had stopped in the doorway. The figure who was clearly watching me. I didn't need to open my eyes to know that. It wasn't Sophie. It was the bogeyman. That was what I told myself. The monster padded clumsily into the room, dropped something heavy on the floor, and then he walked over to my bed. I still remember that stale, unclean breath on my face. I was trembling beneath the duvet, but I held my nerve and prayed the creature wouldn't eat me, and eventually it slowly backed out of the room, closing the bedroom door behind it. I remember eventually opening my eyes to see Sophie lying atop her sleeping bag, still completely passed out after returning from the attic. Her hair was disheveled, and it looked different. At the time, I didn't understand that. She must have been unaware of what happened to her up there. I hope so. I know now, of course, what I was too young to know then. There was something wrong with those sweets. Just as there was something wrong with Grandma and Granddad insisting that I invite Sophie and Francesca. But I remember something else. Something that unravels part of my dad's story. It wasn't Grandma who invited my friends and gave us sweets. It was Granddad.